It is Fabrizio Aiello, the artist for HORACE H. Hoover, and much more. Welcome, Fabrizio.
How's it going? Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, man, it's great to see you. I'm glad to finally get you on, especially at this time when you have issue number 3 about to come out of HORACE H. Hoover.
Yeah, it's exciting. Issue 3 definitely kind of, with each issue you're going to get better, even if you're not trying.
Yeah, well,
So I felt this one really, the writing and the art, everything is sort of gelling. So
excellent. Folks, this is issue number 1 of HORACE H. Hoover and from Alterna Comics. That price is correct. $1.98, folks, for a comic book. Now, I think they've gone up to $2.25. It's still just an amazing deal. It's way better than most of the stuff you're going to find with DC and Marvel. I'm just saying that flat out is the truth. It is a fact. I totally dig his style. The art is fantastic. I can't recommend this book enough. You can get these, and we're going to get to that very soon. You can get the first 2 issues on Alterna. I've been looking at the stuff you have on Etsy, for example.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, you're a Lovecraft fan.
Yeah.
Yeah, so am I. I don't know if you were aware of that, but I'm kind of a big Lovecraft fan.
I mean, when I was growing up, I was trying to think of the first traditional horror book that I read, and it wasn't Lovecraft. It was actually Brian Lumley. I don't know if you're familiar with him.
Brian Lumley, yeah. Didn't he do the Necroscope series?
Yeah. The Necroscope stuff, and I loved it. It's really great, like vampire, supernatural stuff. And then I went back into his catalog, and he has a lot of Lovecraft influence stuff, like Titus Crow and all this kind of stuff. And that's how I found Lovecraft. Because back then, you don't have YouTube, unless... There's no way to make those connections unless it's organically from reading a book and seeing something on it. So that's how I got into Lovecraft. And then from there, it's, it seems like he's blown up over the past, I don't know how many years, but a long time ago, there were only special few of us that knew who he was.
Yes. Yeah, he really started coming back literally like in the late 1960s, early 1970s. And it had, of course, a lot to do with Arkham House. I think that they should be hailed as the people that really brought him back into the forefront. People started reading his stuff again. In the 1970s, he just took off like a rocket. It was hard to believe. Like we were just talking about Journey into Mystery. Of course, there's Chamber of Chills, which also has stuff by the early issues, I should say. Now, these are 1970s Marvel issues, Chamber of Chills. That feature adaptations of Robert E. Howard from Weird Tales, Harlan Ellison, believe it or not, and more Robert Bloch. A lot of various science fiction horror authors, and which is what they were getting into back in the early 70s. They knew. Stan Lee knew. Stan Lee was a Lovecraft fan. There is no doubt about that in my mind now, because seeing what he adapted for Journey into Mystery, for example, and Tower of Shadows. See, the first 5 or 6 issues, it was right in there. First 5 or 6 issues, they were adapting basically Weird Tales writers, including Lovecraft. They adapted The Terrible Old Man for issue number 3, I believe, and that was Barry Windsor Smith that did the art on that. Yeah, fantastic. And then I think it was issue number 8 that Bernie Wrightson adapted Pickman's model.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so really cool stuff. Stan Lee knew all, and Roy Thomas. They were both all over this stuff. And so when I was looking at your Etsy store, I, of course, saw a particular thing that you have on there that is absolutely fantastic. We're going to take a look at that.
As far as like Stan Lee, and Marvel adapting other writers, I think that's one of the most important differences between old writers and new writers. And some new writers will say they're just adapting other comic books. They're just taking old comic books and modifying it, as opposed to going from source material outside the genre, like
Yes.
old sci-fi or old horror. I think that's always the best route to go.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. You're right. And another really welcome thing with Marvel in that time, that early 70s, when they were doing adaptations and, of course, reprinting a lot of their pre-code horror comics in the same, all of the, like Chamber of Chills and Vault of Evil and stuff, all of these have the pre-code horror comic reprints as well within the comics. So it's totally cool. And, but with Lovecraft and Robert E. Howard and Robert Bloch and so forth, all Weird Tales writers, you know, they credited them right up front. And they also went to Arkham House to get permission to do the adaptations for Lovecraft. Are you going to do an adaptation of Lovecraft?
I mean, I think I have to do at least The Picture in the House, which is probably my favorite story.
The Picture in the House.
A Picture in the House. It's very short. It's like 6 pages. Basically, an antiquarian on a bike. It's raining. He's in Massachusetts. He pops into this house for shelter.
Yeah.
And there's a book on the table. It's an old book about cannibals. And there's a guy upstairs. He comes down. It's not supernatural or anything. It's basically about a guy reading a cannibal book, and then a drop of blood hits the page, and then it's the end of the story. But it was short. It was confined to like one location, so I thought it'd be a perfect just way to get my feet wet into narrative storytelling.
Nobody's adapted it. I've never seen it in film adapted, you know.
I haven't. It struck me when I read it. It was short, and the atmosphere was so perfect, and it didn't have any sort of the typical Lovecraft monsters, which I think that's probably why people like, well, it's just almost like a regular, quote unquote, regular horror story. It's not weird fiction really. It's just, it's tangentially related to his stuff, I think.
Folks, this is the campaign, the funding page. I'm going to drop the link into the chat right now so you can take a closer look. There's the link, folks. And the one thing that you'll notice is that the price is $2.25. That's what the price will be for this comic book. It is full color, folks. And it's great. I just showed you issue number 1. Absolutely fantastic. If you could describe the genesis of Horace H. Hoover, how did you come about doing this really odd character that is so compelling at the same time? He's like, you know, when I first saw him, I was like, what? I was like laughing. Then I was like, wait a second, you know. And then I, of course, got the first issue, and I was like, man, this is really good. Horace Hoover is a great character. And I just thought, where did he come up with this idea? Oh.
Yeah. So I before I was kind of jumping into comic books, I was doing these very large, I'll call them caricatures, in graphite or charcoal. So I had done a circle. So you start with big shapes whenever I'm drawing. So, you know, I did a circle and I had done other shapes, and I'm like, you know, I need to do a new one. So I sit down and I kind of do a rectangle as just like the start shape of a head, like a caricatured head. And I put the ear really high up, and then I'm like, that almost looks like a vacuum cleaner. So then I kind of draw in the hose, I put the other wheel, and then he's wearing a suit, and I'm like, it made me chuckle, basically. I'm like, that's kind of funny. And then I set it aside. But I found myself, every time I sat down to draw or sketch or do anything, I started to draw the character. And I drew him in this pose where he's like, his back is arched and his hands are on his hips. And that, like, just with that pose, it really kind of gave me a sense of the character outside of, you know, the design. And then it just kind of grew. I kept on getting these scenes in my head, and I'd sketch them out. I'd just do gestures, and I'd kind of throw them on the wall. I'm like, oh, maybe someday I'll do something with this. Because at this time, I'm doing illustration, and I haven't done really any comic books to any, significant degree. So the idea of me jumping into a new comic book, it just seemed way over my head. Anyway, I kept on cobbling together all of these scenes over and over, and I'm like, well, I'll do a 3D sculpture, and maybe that'll satisfy that itch in my head,
Yes.
So I spend time doing a 3D sculpture, like a 16-inch, maquette. But the first thing people would say to me is like, wow, that's really cool. What's his name? What are his powers? What's his backstory? Everybody wanted to know about the character. So I said, yeah, the only way I can sort of bring him to life, real life, is to do a comic book. So I'm like, all right, I'm just going to head down. I'm going to switch gears. I'm going to go 100% into comic books. And for me, I mean, I grew up in the 80s, late 70s, 80s. So comic books, this is the look of comic books for me. Some people use the 80s as like a kind of gimmick, but they weren't born and they weren't around in the 80s.
Right.
But this is what comic books look like to me. So the idea of doing anything else really didn't fit. So that's kind of how I ended up with this. If I'm going to do one comic, I'm going to put everything that I've ever kind of liked into the comic. So that's why it has all of the elements that I've always loved, either reading about or movies or other books. So it's kind of a mishmash of a few genres. You have a little bit of Lovecraft, like you said. To me, there's a little bit of Douglas Adams in there. There's a little bit of pulpy, sort of classic Buck Rogers or Flash Gordon kind of stuff.
Check out this splash page for Smoke Man Rises. That's the type of page that grabs you and makes you want to read more. So when did you do this model kit? And I mean, it's incredible. In the first place, it's very detailed. Obviously, it's kind of complex, in my opinion, for a resin model kit.
It is.
You got a lot of stuff going. How long did it take you to sculpt it?
Yeah, so I did this. I might be wrong. It's been quite some time. It was before COVID, because basically, just to kind of back up a little bit, before COVID, I was doing resin model kits and sculpting primarily outside of my day job, and I was actually going to start a company doing these. So I have inventory. I have stacks and stacks of these resin model kits. So whenever that happened, conventions got canceled. And once the conventions got canceled, all this stuff went into my storage units. And I'm like, well, I need to do something in the meantime. And that's when I really dug into Horace H. Hoover. So I have a lot of these. As far as sculpting, this took me a while. This probably took me several weeks to sculpt. And it is very complex. So if someone out there does resin kits, hopefully they've been doing them for a while, because there's a lot of little pieces. But the company that actually assembles the final kit, they do an incredible job. Everything fits perfectly. It's packaged incredibly. Yeah. So this was fun. This was a trip to do, though.
Yeah. Now this is the unpainted.
Yep.
Right here. Check that out, folks. I mean, he's got the whole thing is nailed. Even the I don't know, you call it the obelisk.
Yeah.
Structure. The detail on it is just fantastic. That is just one hell of a thing. So it is currently available on Etsy and also Horace H. Hoover, probably by the end of next week, you think?
Yeah. Yep. For sure.
Okay. That is freaking fantastic.
It's one of those funny things where I have read Dagon countless times, but until you're trying to make a sculpture based on it, there are a lot of details and things you're not thinking of. So I reread it, and I'm like, I'm sculpting, and then I reread it again, and it was just little things make all the difference. I put as much of the story as I could into this, every little detail that was in there. When it pops up from the ocean floor, and he talks about how things are just rotting, I'm like, well, I want to throw like some unique deep sea fish and deep sea like bugs, essentially fish bugs,
Yeah.
and put them on there, so they give it just that extra little bit of like weird feel to it.
Yeah. I love the shark down there. That is just totally great.
I don't know if you can see it in the picture, but if you look at his back,
Yeah.
I put those. I can't remember what they're called, but they're essentially parasite fish that
Oh, yeah.
attach themselves. So I
I
put
see one
them.
there.
Yeah. So I added that extra in there. I thought that would
Uh,
be kind of a cool feature.